Jews are not proselytizers, meaning we Jews don't go around the world trying to get people to convert to Judaism, unlike religions like Christianity or Islam, which do seek to have everyone follow their religion. On the other hand, how is it possible that it is? Is the aspiration of Judaism the prophetic vision that everyone in the world will believe in God, and on that day his name will be one, and everything the prophets speak about that final vision? How can we reconcile that if we are not proselytizers, meaning we are not going around looking for people to convert, at the same time we have a universal message? How is this reconciled? I'm going to show you some sources because I recently saw a video of Rabbi Yosef Garmon talking with Rabbi Ishai Harari about how Jews are not proselytizers. But here there is a nuance I would like to clarify, because it's true that we don't seek to convert people to Judaism. However, there is indeed a proselytizing message in Judaism, not to convert people, but to spread the Torah, to spread Judaism itself, but without the need for them to convert. Why do I want to make this video? Because there's a common misunderstanding people sometimes mention in comments. Also, if you read Christian or Islamic literature from recent centuries, there is a false accusation made against Jews that supposedly we are supremacists, and that because we think we are superior, we don't want anyone to enter Judaism. That's not accurate. I'm going to show you some sources. Just as in Judaism, there is the concept of conversions to Judaism. The idea of being supremacist does not exist. It's not because we believe that humanity is inferior in itself, but because we also believe that the other nations of the world are important. We consider that non-Jews also have a role in the world. Not all of humanity has to be Jewish. That's exactly the universal message. That you too, watching this video, whether you're in Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, it doesn't matter where you are. God made you this way because you have a purpose. And I want to show you that. First, let me share some history. In the history of the Jewish people, there were two moments when Jews did actively engage in proselytism, which was during the period of Ezra and Nehemiah. Because there was an issue with men who were Jews marrying women who were not Jewish, and also during a period of the Hasmonean kingdom. After the Maccabean revolt, there was also a region of Idumeans, so they were also forced to convert. Apart from these two periods in the ancient world, there were no other times when Jews had a proselytizing campaign, that is, of making people convert to Judaism. There were no more. There are those who believe that during the period of Roman occupation in Judea, that is, in the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, they also think that at this time there were campaigns to convert people to Judaism. But academia has reevaluated this. And why do they believe this? Because they take some quotes from the Talmud, which are legends like that of Onkelos, talking with Roman soldiers who converted, and one of the quotes, and perhaps it is the only explicit source that talks about supposed Jewish proselytism, is this one. And it is in the Christian Bible, which says in Matthew 23, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." Supposedly Jesus says this, but honestly I don't think Jesus actually said it, because the word hypocrites doesn't exist in ancient Hebrew or in Aramaic, and Jesus spoke Aramaic. It's a word from Greek theater, hypocrites. But that's why I believe Jesus never said this phrase. But later, the editor of Matthew put it in Jesus' mouth. But in any case, Pharisees, hypocrites. And the phrase is because they traveled to make a single proselyte. So, para ser un solo prosélito. Entonces, there are people here who believe that this is historical evidence of why supposedly the Jews were seeking to make proselytes. Nowadays, academic research has already evaluated whether that passage reveals a historical reality. And no, there was no historical reality in which the Jews were seeking converts in the time of the Roman Empire. What it reflects is rhetoric. Here I show you, for example, a fragment from Michael Bird's research, where he analyzes this topic historically and linguistically. And he concludes that no, there was no proselytism, but rather it is more of a rhetorical issue. That is a very minority view among historians, those who believe that there was active proselytism by the Jews from the period of Julius Caesar until the War of the Year 70, once again. The vast majority of scholars do not think that. But what did happen? And there are many sources on this, more than 300 documents on the subject. In the ancient world, many pagans, people who were not Jews, were attracted to Judaism because it had many good social ideas, like the idea of monotheism. So these were people who approached Judaism but did not convert. In other words, they came closer on their own. And what about the Jews? Many times this made them happy, and they welcomed them with open arms. Those were called, for example, they were referred to as God-fearers or sebomenoi, menuentes or Dios sebéis. And for people who want to know more about the topic, I have two videos on the subject, one showing archaeologically how there are many scholars who consider that these at the time were not agidas, and there are inscriptions of this in some synagogues in Asia Minor. And I also have a video with Dr. Antonio Pinheiro, who is an expert on the subject, who also talks about how the God-fearers, who were these non-Jews attracted to Judaism, followed what are known as the non-Agidic laws. You can see them. They're on my channel. So these were people who were not Jews, who came to Judaism on their own, and Judaism welcomed them with open arms, not because it was looking for them, but because they came. And these were what you could call non-Agidic at that time, who were called God-fearers, and all the terms in Greek, like theosebes and so on. That means that there is indeed the idea that Jews hope people will come to Judaism, or at least to the ideas of Judaism, but not necessarily that they will convert. I'll explain this because it can be confusing. Some think Jews, seen as supremacists, don't want to convert. I'll clarify briefly. If the prophet said that at the end of times, the nations will recognize Israel, for example, that's how the book of Isaiah begins in chapter 2. That's how the book of Zechariah ends. That's what the prophet Micah says, and so on. All the prophets basically talk about this, about the nations and about Israel, and all of them knowing the idea of God. It means that if the Jews, the people of Israel, are a nation, there are also other nations. It's not that everyone becomes the nation of Israel. There are other nations. That's the point. That's why we believe that people don't need to convert to Judaism in order to love Hashem, God, or to be able to take part with God. Therefore, non-Jews neither have the obligation nor the need to convert to Judaism. But what they are obligated to do, non-Jews are obligated to follow the Noahide laws. I'm not going to go into much detail about this topic. I'll share a playlist with you that has more than 100 videos on the subject. Anyway, let's suppose that in the ancient world there was a proselytizing factor in Judaism, that they sought converts. Nowadays in Judaism that doesn't exist. Maybe there were some very specific individuals who engaged in it. I think it's terrible that there are people on social media trying to convert non-Jews to Judaism because, in my opinion, that's actually being supremacist. Because that means if you think non-Jews don't have a role, you're going to try to make them like you. As an aside, I don't mean to offend any Christians or Muslims watching this. Do you want everyone to think like Muslims? That means they believe everyone else is wrong. That is supremacism. In Judaism, we don't start from that idea. We believe everyone has a role and that there are many paths to God, so not everyone needs to convert. The moment someone tries to convince others to convert to Judaism, in my opinion, that is supremacism, because it's trying to deny the possibility that other people, without being Jewish, can reach God, and that's against the sources, as we will see. In any case, there is no evidence that Jews engaged in active proselytism. You can read this in the book by Naomi Pazajov and Robert Liedman called A Concise History of the Jewish People on page 67. Now let's move on to the next section of this video, where we will analyze whether there are any Jewish sources that prohibit proselytism. Because it's one thing that Jews haven't had a campaign to convert people to Judaism, but maybe it's actually a prohibition. And the truth is that there are indeed sources that prohibit going around convincing people to convert to Judaism. But there are also sources that say we should spread the Noahide laws. That is, we should explain to non-Jews that they also have a role as non-Jews. That's why I was telling you that in the video with Rabbi Garmon and Rabbi Ishai Harari, there's a nuance. That is, we are not proselytizers going around looking for people to convert, but we are, you could say, proselytizers in a certain sense when it comes to spreading the Noahide laws. Not proselytizers to get people to convert, but yes, to bring them closer to the idea of Judaism. Because the Noahides, the non-Jews who follow these moral and ideological standards of Judaism, in my opinion, are part of Judaism even though they are not Jews. So let's look at some sources about this. The first example I want to show you, this is brought by Bahalia Tosafot, which is in the Tractate of Yevamot. It's from the Talmud. A commentary they make about a phrase that is in the Talmud that says the following: misfortune after misfortune will come to those who accept converts. A very strong phrase. But here, Bahalia Tosafot explains, saying, Rabbi Isaac said, this refers to the case when non-Jews are persuaded to convert or when they are accepted immediately. In other words, making conversions easier. The proselytism of going out to seek conversions. That is what brings misfortune after misfortune. But if they, meaning the non-Jews, make an effort to convert, That is, on their own initiative. In other words, the non-Jew is the one who approaches Judaism and seeks to convert. We have the obligation to accept them. Here we see how, yes, there are sources that prohibit proselytism to convert people to Judaism. Next source. This is already halacha. That's halacha, not just commentary around the Talmud, but the actual halachic ruling that says one should not persuade non-Jews to convert, but if they strive to convert, one must accept them. The next source is brought by Harosh, parenthesis. Who was Harosh? He was Rabbeinu Asher ben Yechiel, who was one of the sages of the 13th century and is one of the main pillars who established halacha, that is Jewish law as it is understood today. He's one of the pillars chosen by the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is like the book that determined the practice of Jewish law up to the present day. And the author of the Shulchan Aruch chose the three pillars, who are Maimonides, the Rif, and Harosh. Let's see what Harosh says about this. He says, will those who accept converts face repeated misfortune? As we saw. That is, there are indeed halachic sources stating that one should not convince people to convert to Judaism. For Jews wanting to review these sources, note this is only a fragment, as the Rosh's explanations are much more extensive. For example, Harosh explains the case of, for instance, when a non-Jew went to Hillel and told him that he wanted to convert and learn the entire Torah while standing on one foot. They analyze these topics. I mean, it's not that he just comments without having analyzed a number of sources beforehand. What we've seen so far, and I'll show you more sources in a moment, is that we Jews are forbidden to go out and seek people to convert them to Judaism. Therefore, we are not proselytizers. What it does say is that if a person approaches Judaism, you shouldn't accept them right away as you saw, but rather you have to review. You really have to make sure that the person truly wants to convert. And therefore, after having gone through that process, by not accepting them immediately, you welcome the person who converts with open arms. There are many sources in the Torah above all, and throughout the Talmud as well, that say you must love converts. So just so you know, I want to make that clear as well. I'm not against converts. On the contrary, I give them a big hug, a big round of applause as well for joining the people of Israel. On the other hand, I also don't think that non-Jews have to aspire to become Jewish. I also believe that non-Jews are important. Hashem created them too because they also have a role, and Hashem loves them as well. So now here's a question. What does it mean that the convert is not accepted immediately? Here I will show you a halacha, that is again, a Jewish law which Maimonides brings, and it says the following. How are righteous converts received? As an aside, Maimonides writes mekablin, receives, because Maimonides is very careful, very precise with his words. Because he doesn't start from the idea that you have to go look for the convert, but rather how to receive them. The convert is the one who comes to convert. How do you receive righteous converts? When someone comes from among the non-Jews to convert, they must be investigated. And if no hidden reason is found that would invalidate their intention, they are received. That is, the non-Jew comes. And if they are not converting for some personal interest, or because, I don't know, they want something else, right? There are several laws, but I won't discuss conversion laws now. But do you understand that the fact that Maimonides discusses, even hides, how much needs to be checked and how much doesn't, means that Jews are not proselytizers? Because if we were proselytizers, this whole discussion wouldn't exist. If someone wants to convert, they're welcomed. Like in Christianity, they're baptized, and in Islam, you say a phrase to become Muslim. Shahada states Muhammad is Allah's messenger. That's all it takes to be Muslim. In Judaism, it's not like that. Next source, the Mordechai, also one of the great legislators of Jewish law, says, it seems to me that someone who comes before us to convert, and we know they're doing it for some personal benefit, we shouldn't accept them. Again, notice the language. Someone who comes to convert, and we shouldn't accept them. This means that Jews are not proselytizers, and there are sources that deny proselytism in Judaism. Next source is from Meiri, and this is a brutally anti-proselytism source. In other words, it's the opposite of proselytism, and that's even though Meiri in many cases is highly permissive. And it says the following. A person should always refrain from accepting converts, unless they have undergone a thorough examination in the way it was explained in this tractate. This is because they might be converting for some self-interested reason, and their intention might not be pure at all. Bro, nobody can tell me This isn't an anti-proselytizing source. I mean, no one in their right mind is going to tell me that Judaism has a proselytizing campaign. When I've shown you Jewish legal authorities from the last millennium, what are they telling you? No, don't just accept it like that. No, we're not proselytizers. There are many more sources like this, just to mention a few from Halacha, like the Torah in the Yoredea, 268, in the Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, Law 117. There are many. The common factor is that they use this language of lekabel, of receiving converts, and that the person, Shebalaijayer in Hebrew, the person who comes to convert, again, the same language, evidence. I mean, thinking more on a philological level, because I don't know if you knew that I'm a researcher at the academy. We'll talk a bit about that soon, because I'm going to show you some Talmud manuscripts about the idea of proselytism, but that shows, even on a linguistic level, that Jews are not proselytizers. Next source. Converts who converts whose conversion was at all once their lie is discovered and not continue to be idolaters. We are in every generation. And our sages cursed those who accepted them without having examined or thoroughly investigated the reasons for their conversion. In conclusion, we Jews are not proselytizers. Here, I show you another source, which is more modern. This is one of the rabbis of our time, and I must say that he is one of the most pluralistic rabbis in all of modern orthodoxy. And he writes, if the rabbinical court were to accept someone who does not intend to observe the commandments, this would harm the people of Israel. So it doesn't make sense to say that we have been, or whatever, proselytizers, because we are not. And there are many sources, as I told you, that say this. In fact, in the Talmud, there is even a rather extreme phrase that says, our teachers taught, converts are not accepted in the days of the Messiah. How can you tell me that? And I've seen this on social media. Some people say, no, in Judaism, there are no sources that say proselytism is not done. Now, I want to show you a midrash that is in the Talmud, which some people use to try to say that Jews are indeed proselytizers. Let me clarify that it is a midrash because it is not halacha. Midrash is more homiletic. It is not practical Jewish law. The phrase is in the Talmud, in the tractate of Pesachim, and it says the following. Rabbi de Azar said, the Holy One, blessed be He, that is God, exiled Israel among the nations only so that converts would. So they take this phrase and say, look, of course, if the purpose of the exile is to have converts, we must fulfill that purpose of the exile, which is to go and seek converts. So we must be proselytizers. No, that's not what the phrase says. And in fact, the wording of the phrase is very precise. That's why it says, she itofu. Some say itofu or itvasfu alem gerim. That's the verb in question. It's a reflexive verb. What does it mean? A reflexive verb. In Hebrew and also in Spanish, actually there's a verb form where the action falls back on the person. That is, it's not that Israel is going to add converts, but rather that the converts themselves are the ones who join. That is, the action falls again. Not that Israel seeks out converts, but rather the convert joins Israel. That's the point of this phrase. And by the way, what I'm telling you is after having consulted with groups of Spanish-speaking rabbis, also among academics from Bar Ilan University, from the Faculty of Talmud, no less, and with a couple of Hebraists, one from the Hebrew University. And for those who know, this is the response from Professor Avshalom Koch. Dr. Avshalom Koch is perhaps the most prominent linguist of our entire generation. I met him when I was 15 years old, when I participated in the World Bible Contest, and this was the answer he gave to my question.
This is a photo of a construction. Noise from construction done on a saint's tongue.
The answer was in Hebrew. I gave it for those who understood. But what he is saying is that this is a reflexive verb form and that it generally applies to the nations. How do we know this? Here, one of the rabbis I told you, I consulted, showed me one of the other sources. This is from Rav Nachman of Breslov, who was a sage from a couple of centuries ago, who writes, Itosfu veit rabu. Both are in the itpel verb form, again, which are reflexive. That they gather and that they increase. That is, the action applies to the nations. I'm going to show you some manuscripts where one might think that this is not the case. I want to make a brief aside here. And for those who are new to the channel, my name is Yaakov Amar Rothstein. I'm not only a rabbi and a chemical engineer, but I'm also a researcher in Israeli academia. And since I'm a researcher and have access to all kinds of academic sources and manuscripts, I want to tell you that the Talmud, nowadays, we have a standardized version based on the Vilna edition, which is this one, the printed one. But before, there were manuscripts, and sometimes in the manuscripts you can see slight variations. I want to show you one of these variations. This is in the Kassel manuscript. And what it says here, the verb is shi tosifu alem gerim. This means to add to them, in parentheses, increase. That is, it refers to an action. In parentheses, the verb is like tosifu alim, as it is a verb. In plural, it refers to the nations adding again, even in the variations of the manuscripts, when the verb appears differently. In the variations, it also means that it is the nations who add themselves as converts. This is another manuscript that I also found, which reads Maastricht in parentheses. I saw several manuscripts, and in all the manuscripts, it is like in the printed Talmud. I'm just showing you the two variations that I found among the nations. Half a dozen manuscripts that I was researching, and in this manuscript, it reads a little more oddly. It says Tosifu alim gerim. This can also be understood as a reflexive, because it's tusfu, tosifu. That they unite over them converts. Again, the verb applies to the nations. So we see that even this passage from the Talmud that they try to use to say that we should proselytize. No, what it says is that the nations are added to Israel and not that Israel adds the converts. We have to be careful with that. And in fact, what I just told you, that is also the opinion of Ben Shishai. Maybe I'll show you the quote about that right now because he explains exactly what I'm telling you. As a side note, I didn't really want to discuss this, but I'll share with you that there were others like Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen Hakon Milublin in Pri Tzadik in the Aparashat Para. He and also the Magan Chajida write this. The Ramchal writes this when commenting on a verse from Micah. He writes that even this source is not talking about converts, but rather about other things, not converts themselves. So, just so you know, there were even thinkers in Judaism who took it even further to even say that we don't even accept converts. That's just an aside. I think the phrase does refer to converts in the plain sense, just as it is. But just so you know, to show you how non-proselytizing we are, that position also exists. Now, I want to show you another one of the laws legislated by Maimonides. And it says like this: Moses, our teacher, that is, Moshe, did not give the Torah and the commandment, except to Israel and anyone from the other nations who wishes to convert. Whoever does not wish to convert is not obligated to accept the Torah and the commandments. Can you tell me that we are proselytizers when Maimonides himself is telling me that we shouldn't go out and proselytize? Moshe, yes, the one from the Bible, commanded by God's instruction to obligate all the inhabitants of the world to accept the commandments that were given to the children of Noah. In other words, the Noahide laws, and anyone who does not accept them must be executed. A rather harsh ending, obviously. But Maimonides here is telling me two things. Don't force people who are not Jewish. Don't force them to follow the laws of Judaism, because those are the heritage of Israel from Morashake and the Diako. But the nations of the world should be obligated to follow the Noahide laws. Then there is a letter by Maimonides. I also have an academic article about this letter, which is a response to the students of Rabbi Ephraim, which is in the Shud 149 from Blau Publishing. Yes, because Farshan Publishing is another number where he writes about this law. And he says that people who are not Jewish should not be allowed to study Torah. But that's only when we have Yad Kifa, meaning when we have the option. But in the meantime, if a person who is Christian wants to learn about Judaism in order to convert, they are taught because they have the Tanakh, which is the common factor, and so on. I'm not going to talk much about that. And well, about the end of that phrase that says, we must force, and whoever does not follow the Noahide laws must be executed, there are several poskim who obviously explain that this is very harsh. Obviously, it perhaps refers to those who are in the territory that was conquered during wars, or that, like, they try to give more context to the words to say, don't go around executing people. Yes, that's the point. But the principle that you can see here is that Maimonides says the idea is that there isn't any. You don't have to convince people to follow Judaism by converting, but rather, for the one who comes close and converts, the Torah is also for him. But for the nations, there are the Noahide laws, and that is indeed an ideal in the worldview of Judaism. That's why I'm surprised to see on social media 1, 2, or 3 rabbis saying that the Noahide laws are completely irrelevant. So then they say, no, well, let's convert everyone because of that, or let's teach Kabbalah to people, or I don't know what, even though those are not the principles that were discussed. Judaism, in fact, and just between us, there's something I really don't like at all from the sources of Kabbalah. It's the way, I'm not going to say racist, but so serious, the way they see non-Jews, how they're so tzitzit, sone tamtzit klipat atuma, and sone from klipat noga, and I'm not going to translate these Kabbalistic terms for you, since you don't want to know, because I know that most of the people who watch this are not Jewish. I don't like those sources, and that's why I'm surprised that there's interest, considering there are sources in the Kabbalah, in the Zohar. The Zohar, for example, says that you can't teach Torah to people who are not Jewish. That's why I'm surprised that these people suggest to others, no, well, let's study all these things. But what is ideal is to fulfill the Noahide laws. I'll show you the following source. This is Tosafot in the Tractate of Hagigah in the Talmud. And it says, there's a phrase that says, a non-Jew who engages in the study of the Torah is deserving of the death penalty. That's where Maimonides gets it from, about the death penalty for someone who studies Torah and for the one who teaches it, meaning for someone who teaches Torah to people who are not Jewish. He is transgressing by putting a stumbling block before the blind, since if non-Jews aren't supposed to study Torah, teaching Torah to them would be a transgression. And if you say that it refers to the 7 Noahide laws, which are the laws of the nations for which one is not deserving of the death penalty, as the Talmud says, then in that case, it is a mitzvah to teach them those laws. So what is Tosafot saying here? It is forbidden to teach Torah to non-Jews, but it is a mitzvah, an obligation to teach the Noahide laws. That is what Tosafot writes. So, when they ask me if Jews are not proselytizers, that's why I told them. There is a nuance. We do not seek for people to convert to Judaism, but there are sources that tell us, lead us, and push us. Did you see Maimonides say we must obligate the nations? That seems a bit extreme. It's because of Maimonides' context. Maimonides' thinking is developed from philosophers like Avudraham, Abu Nazar al-Farbi, and Ibn Sina, who are Islamic philosophers. So it's not surprising that he has a let's say, universalist idea of this kind. That's Maimonides. It's worth noting Tosafot from the Ashkenazi world, who hold the opposite view and describe it as a mitzvah. It's an obligation to teach the Noahide laws to non-Jews, not to teach them the laws of Israel, not to teach Judaism per se, but the Noahide laws, which, again, in my opinion, are also Judaism. Where does Tosafot get this from? That source I just showed you. They take it from the Talmud. The Talmud says it. This is a discussion in Tractate Sanhedrin. It says, Rabbi Yochanan said a non-Jew who engages in the study of the Torah is deserving of the death penalty, because it is written, the Torah was commanded to us by Moses as an inheritance for the congregation of Yaakov. For us, it is an inheritance and not for them. That is, the Torah was given to Israel. But wow, there's an objection here. They bring in another rabbi, who is Rabbi Meir, and he says, he used to say, from where? We know that even a non-Jew who dedicates himself to the study of the Torah is like the high priest. Imagine that, so much so that if a non-Jew studies Torah, he is like the high priest. And here he brings the verse to justify what he is saying and says, you learn that even a non-Jew who dedicates himself to the study of the Torah is like a high priest. So what do? There are two positions, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Meir. One says that if a non-Jew studies Torah, he deserves the death penalty, but the other says no, that a non-Jew who studies Torah is like the high priest. So, it's contradictory, right? No. The Talmud reconciles both positions, saying that there it refers to the 7 laws that apply to him. That's right. This discussion between the two sages, including Rabbi Meir, ends this way. When it says that the non-Jew who studies Torah is like the high priest, it refers to when the non-Jew studies the Noahide laws, their own laws, the laws of the nations. It means like the high priest. That's what it refers to. And it means that Rabbi Yochanan's position is still correct. The principle here is that in the Torah, the laws of Judaism themselves are for Israel and for the nations. He is considered like the high priest. If they follow the Noahide laws, if you understand me, source after source talks about this topic, about the importance of the Noahide laws. Another source from Maimonides says, a non-Jew who dedicates himself to the study of the Torah is deserving of the death penalty. He should only dedicate himself to his 7 laws. Only there does Maimonides legislate, following the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan and the general opinion of the Sanhedrin. The next law says, because this is, you see in the Jumijim 10, law number 9 and law number 10, Halasha 10, it says, a son of Noah, that is a non-Jew who wishes to perform one of the other commandments of the Torah in order to receive a reward, should not be prevented from doing so according to his laws. What? How is that? Maimonides contradicts himself. How can he claim a non-Jew studying the Torah deserves the death penalty? But then, in the next law, he's telling me that if a non-Jew wants to fulfill the Torah or take on some law from the Torah, he gets a reward, and he can't be prevented from doing it. Because here the language is that if a person is a Noahide, he is already within this covenant that God has with humanity. He is within the threshold of Judaism. And that's why his horizons regarding Judaism are broader. A person who is an idolater, who doesn't even believe in the principles of Judaism, how are you going to allow him to do things related to Judaism if he doesn't even follow the fundamentals of Judaism? That's the point there. That's why he uses a very specific language. And this is what I just explained to you. The Khatam Sofer explains it. And that's why Maimonides explains this difference between the two of them there. This is again from Hagosh, which I explained to you is one of the pillars that established Jewish law as it is understood today. It says, and if you ask, does it refer to teaching them their 7 laws? We already said there that it is a mitzvah to teach them their precepts, not just that it is allowed. So that's the point here. Not only is it permitted to teach them, it is a mitzvah. It is an obligation. We Jews have to teach the Noahide laws to people, according to what Hagosh writes. Next source, Gavot Wotitzchak says, regarding the 7 laws specific to non-Jews, that is, the Noahide laws, there is a precept to teach them, since even a non-Jew who dedicates himself to the study of the Torah is considered like a high priest. And since he is like a high priest, not only is it not forbidden to teach him, but on the contrary, it is an obligation to teach him. If you understand me, this totally changes the paradigm, because it means that there are proselytizing sources in Judaism, but not for conversion. There are proselytizing sources to explain the Noahide laws. That's one of the points. That's why I mentioned the nuance in the next source I want to show you. The Meshesh Chochma, commenting on the parasha of Beshvat Abba Hashad, says that although the nations are not required to convert, they are required to observe the 7 laws, the Noahide laws. Klither, this is simply the commandment of order and acknowledgement of the Creator. To me, this quote seems to reflect and encapsulate what we've been talking about. Basically, it says, don't be a proselytizer trying to convert the nations, but you should, and this is the term used by the K-Off, compel them to observe the Noahide laws. That's what connects them to the Creator. Which I tried to say at the start of the video. Non-Jews can also connect with God, and they don't have to convert to Judaism to do it. And this is the huge difference compared to ideologies like Christianity and Islam. The commandment monarchy, the commandment of the monarchy. And the commandment monarchy Judaism, the commandment that all nations have a role, all nations have the monarchy and one has to do it, but there are in the framework where the monarchy, the human being acts so that this covenant with God can be achieved. Now I'm going to commandment the monarchy and the commandment monarchy and the commandment the monarchy and the commandment of the monarchy. Violate the commandment of monarchy and the commandment monarchy. They will try to explain that what Maimonides says is perhaps in the context of war, that if you conquer or go out to war, you must force them to follow non-Ajidic laws. I am going to show you a source. This is in Mishpat Chamalucha, and it says, although we are commanded to require everyone to accept the 7 non-Ajidic laws, it is a particular mitzvah, in such a way that each individual can obligate. That is, every Jew has this obligation. It's not in the context of war. In other words, there is no obligation to go to war because of this, to put ourselves at risk, unless it is by the order of the king or with the consent of the Sanhedrin. That is, even though Maimonides says that we have to make the nations keep the Noahide laws, we don't have to go to war for this. But there is an obligation for every Jew to impose the Noahide laws. The word impose is a term we need to be careful with, and this is explained by the Rebbe Chabad. Imposing doesn't mean violently. It can also be through persuasion. It's in quotes, impose. In other words, he uses linguistics a bit to explain that the point isn't so much about saying, I'm going to force you, follow the Noahide laws or else. No, that's not it. It's not about taking hostages now. Rather, the point is to spread, to explain, to emphasize the importance of humanity following the Noahide laws. That's the point here. About this topic, and for anyone who's interested, this book was personally given to me by Rabbi Dr. Miel Schulman. What he did was compile the talks given by the Lubavitcher Rebbe. May his memory be a blessing. The topic is the Noahide law salas, discussed in the book's early chapters. He talks about this topic, about how obligating the nations should be understood, not as forcing the nations, but as explaining to the nations. that this is one way we should fulfill it. In any case, the Jews of our generation. And by the way, the Lubavitcher Rebbe was Hasidic. I am not Hasidic. Just so you see that this spectrum comes from the Talmud and the Tosafists and goes through Maimonides. And through all those lawmakers, many of whom are not Hasidic. But particularly in the Hasidic world, the Noahide laws are to be spread among the nations. It takes on a very important significance because there are many Hasidic groups from Satmar to Breslov and Chabad, which is the group. Yes, they agree that the Noahide laws must be actively spread. But again, this is not just in the Hasidic world. In general, the sources, as we've seen, talk about that. Now, I'm going to show you the next source, which is truly mind-blowing. I mean, it blows your mind. Because how much is Judaism not proselytizing? So Maimonides tells us this. If a person was a minor when the court immersed him to convert him, I mean, in a mikveh, and they converted him as a child, his parents wanted to convert the family, so they converted him. He can reject the conversion when he reaches adulthood and remain only as a ger toshav. Ger toshav is like the Noahides. They have permission to live in the land of Israel. You understand the level. Conversions in general are not reversible. We saw that they are reversible. We saw that source that says if a person converted with an intention that was not correct, then their conversion is invalid. Okay? But here Maimonides is telling me that if a person reaches the age when he can decide his own destiny, that is, adulthood, the age of majority, he decides he doesn't want to be Jewish and felt forced into it as a child. As a child, he didn't choose. His parents decided, or maybe he was an orphan. I'm not sure. And they converted him to Judaism. When he is finally able to choose, he can choose not to be Jewish. Imagine that. How can you tell me there are no sources against proselytism? That Jews are proselytizers when you have sources like this? That a person can disregard the fact that they were converted when they didn't want to convert. Do you understand me? The anti-proselytism. Maimonides writes this. That's right. But once the person reaches adulthood and doesn't protest at that moment, they can't accept it. In other words, instead, they're considered as Jewish, and it's by their own awareness, and they admit they're Jewish. And then they say, no, I don't want to be Jewish anymore. Well, at that point, there's no turning back. Because once you're Jewish forever. Here is the commentary by Benish Benishash. I mentioned to you about that passage from the Talmud that we explain linguistically with manuscripts. He says, our sages said, Israel was not exiled among the nations except so that converts would join them. In other words, the intention is for converts to join you, right? Useful. That is to say, that converts are those who join Israel. That they be as upright as you are. And it's not necessary for you, Israel, the Jews, it's not necessary for you to go into exile among the nations for this reason. But even in times when converts are added, God will bless you as he promised, so that you may dwell securely in your land. What is Benish Benishai saying here? That also Benish Benishai, one of the great lawmakers, all of this, exegetus, a giant, he's telling you that if the Talmud said that the role of exile was that the converts would join Israel, it's telling you, it doesn't mean you have to go into exile. Nothing to do with that. You don't have to go do this. It means that even when there is a unintentional proselytism of Judaism occurs during exile, with some joining Israel. Benish Benishai explains this. You don't have to do it actively. Not even exile makes it active. That's why it's active here. Here you have the source that says, that's how God sows Israel, in the lands, in exile, so that converts will join them. But as long as they behave with them with deceit, who will stick to them? I mean, what does this phrase mean? The point is not that we convince people to convert to Judaism, but that we have to behave well. Why? Because good behavior makes people admire Judaism and want to convert. That is to say, the people who approach Judaism, it's because they admire Judaism or because they admire the Jew. That's why. It's that spark that gets ignited. Because what that source is telling you, that I just showed you, and that I'm showing you again on the screen, is that the point is that if you are surrounded by people who are not Jewish, behave well. Because this makes people have a good opinion of Judaism to the point that they will join. Or Chotzadekim brings up the same idea. He says God scattered Israel across the lands, that is in exile, so that converts would join them. And as long as they behave with them without deceit, they will join them. It's the same idea. If we behave well, we set a good example. And people want to convert. Not because we convince them to convert, but because of our behavior as Jews. It makes people feel admiration and want to convert. Again, there is no proselytism. What it is cause and effect of behavior or of what the Jew or Judaism inspires. The next source I'm showing you here is more Hasidic sources. I'm telling you this because I saw a person who belongs also to a Hasidic group, it doesn't matter which one, saying that if we have to proselytize, we have to bring back my brothers from the lost house, from who knows where, that it's because of the Sephardim, the Sephardic people, as they say, who are lost among the nations. Well, no, let's look at Hasidic sources and see what they say. Regarding the phrase we mentioned, Israel was only exiled so that converts would join them. And at first glance, does Israel really have to go into exile because of the converts? It would have been more appropriate for the nations to come to Israel on their own and convert there. But the thing is that the sacred spark within them is what awakens them to convert. This is from the source of Rabbi Melech de Ligens, who again is one of the pillars of one of the main branches of the Hasidic movement. We adopt the same idea from the behavior of the Jewish people. Here I show you another source. It says, only by seeing and observing Israel and the awakening of the sacred spark within granted, so that they convert. That is, the desire comes from the people themselves to want kiyum, dawat. It is not something active in us. Next source. And Moshe, our teacher, may in 70 languages. In other words, there is a universe factor in writing the Torah. But he did not go to deliver it to them. He did not go to give the Torah to the nations actively. That is, he did not go to preach. He did not go to proselytize. Instead, he wrote them on the stones and left them available. Or as Ezekiel, like the nations on their own initiative, sent scribes and copied them. This means that, again, there's no proselytizing factor in the matter of conversions and all of this. And I'm going to show you the last source to wrap up the video, say that even the phrase that Israel goes into exile, so there will be converts, is a midrash. And that's not a reason for us to seek exile. That shouldn't be proactive either. And it also says that no, it's because we have to behave well, that by behaving well, that inspires people to convert. They're trying to explain to you that there is no proselytism. Don't be a proselytizer. To the Jew, yes. People, if you like the Torah, come. We are not like those religions in the world that do proselytize. But there is a source that I want to show you, which is very impactful, and it's Yajim in the Pirkei Avot. It says, the converts mentioned in Pesachim, in that phrase we saw from the Midrash, that Israel did not go into exile except so that converts would join them. Those converts refer to the nations learning from their actions, meaning that if Israel behaves well and from their faith, so that they become something similar to the Ger Toshav. Again, Ger Toshav are those people who are Noahides, who have permission to live in the land of Israel. Something similar to the Ger Toshav means Noahides. So basically, and Yajim, and this is a source that really impacts me, just so you can see to what extent exegesis can go. That phrase we saw doesn't even talk about converts themselves. It talks about, and let me remind you, there were those who said, for example, it's in the Ari, who talks about the nitzotzot that are in the Klipat Noga to attract them, because that's where the Kedusha is. All of it, things from Kabbalah and things like that. But this particular phrase is saying that it's not referring to converts, but rather to Noahides, basically. That the role of Israel in exile is for people to be inspired by Judaism and become Noahides. That's what it's saying, in other words. So just so you see that detail, there's a lot to talk about on this topic. For example, there's a midrash that says Abraham, our patriarch, in Haran. So he made souls in Haran. What does that mean? They're trying to make an anachronism. Yes. So Abraham, I'm going to make a video, did proselytize according to this source, for example, and many others. Just as a fun fact, to give you a little taste of what's coming. Maimonides, in his Sefer HaMitzvot, the Book of Commandments, commandment number 3 brings this up to explain about aspect of Judaism, but at the same time, legislating that we shouldn't convert people or convince them to convert, but rather that they should become Noahides. There's a lot to talk about on this topic. And what I do want to end this video with is that I don't believe we should close the doors to converts. On the contrary, we do need to be careful, as our sources say, but Jews, even though we're not proselytizers, we also shouldn't sugarcoat conversions. I also think that people who want to be part of the people of Israel, we do need to carefully evaluate how to do this in a way that we're not too rigid, that we are good at this. At the end of the day, the Torah tells us many times to love the convert, and it's one of the commandments we must keep in mind. That's on one hand. And on the other hand, remember, and I say this to all my Jewish friends who are watching this video, and also to the non-Jews who are watching this, especially, importance of the Noahide laws. The Noahide laws, we saw that it is a great foundation in our sources, that this is indeed an aspiration of Judaism, and that with God's help, this is how the words of the prophet are fulfilled. That on that day, the nations of the great rabbis of Israel today, including Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, Rav Obadiah, and Rav Lau, interpret it this way, that these prophecies refer to the Noahide laws. And about that too, not only do I already have a video, but I will release it again, that the goal is for this universal knowledge to exist. Through the Torah, there's no need for everyone to convert to Judaism. Sending warm greetings from Israel and wishing you success. Thank you.